right, let's get things rolling here. So good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to our conversation today, cybercrime on the dark web. By the end of today's conversation, you're going to have a very clear understanding of what the dark web is. You're going to find out how criminals are using the dark web to target us, and then practical steps that we can take to protect ourselves. My name is Rob Schenk, and I'm with Intelligent Technical Solutions, and we specialize in helping small and medium-sized businesses thrive by managing and securing their technology. So just a few housekeeping notes before we get into this too deeply. The conversation is going to run around 30 minutes or so. We're going to stick around for some questions at the end. The conversation will be recorded. So if you'd like to review some of the information later at your convenience or share it with team members, you'll be able to do so. We're also happy to take questions during the webinar. We want to, make this as collaborative as we can. So you'll see in your Zoom, webinar box there, you can see a Q&A button. You can go ahead and add your questions there, and we'd be happy to take those as we move through the webinar. All righty, so let's get moving here. You're going to notice a QR code in the bottom right corner there. So that's going to lead to a special offer for attendees of today's webinar. If you happen to need to leave early or anything, you can go ahead and take a photo of that and connect with your phone, and you can scan that later. So you can go ahead and take advantage of the special offer. So for today's discussion, I'd love to welcome our special guest, Earl Fischl. Earl brings over 21 years of cyber and data analytics experience to Field Effect. He has experience in operations, strategic management, and government service as well. He has a unique background in political science, which enables him to approach cyber not only as a technical challenge, but also a sophisticated kind of espionage issue. I'd love to hear more about that, Earl. Blending technical and strategic perspectives seamlessly. So welcome, Earl, and look forward to the conversation today.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, happy to be here.
All right, so let's get started here. So got a lot to talk about. It's kind of a little bit of a challenge taking all this kind of immense information out there about the dark web and really kind of slimming it down into like a cohesive narrative that won't get people lost in the weeds and provides a really a large amount of educational value. So hopefully we're going to hit that mark today. So first off, we're going to go through an introduction of what is the dark web. We'll talk about why it's important to know what's happening out there. And then we're going to get familiar with the types of cybercrime that's happening out on the dark web. And with that awareness, we'll be able to better protect ourselves and avoid becoming victims. So then we'll dive into some questions from the audience. So lots to cover. So I guess without further ado, Earl, let's get started here.
Sounds great.
What is the dark web? So what is it? Why should we care? What do we want to know about it? Maybe you can get started with that, Earl.
Yeah, it's exactly the perfect place to begin, of course. So kind of setting the stage or giving us all the lay of the land in terms of the dark web. As IT professionals, really what we're talking about here is frankly any part of the internet that requires special know-how, usually specialized software or applications in order to access. It's traditionally associated primarily with Tor or the onion router, which you've probably heard of. Tor is an encrypted network. It's a method of obfuscating the origin of network traffic and providing a layer of privacy protection and anonymity. And traditionally, when most people defined the dark web, they kind of began with Tor, the onion router. There are other similar technologies like it, but the definition as it relates to us has kind of been extended much more these days to include platforms, as you can see some examples here, like messaging applications like Telegram and Discord and other sort of communities that afford an opportunity for cyber criminals who are interested in to gather, share tools and techniques, and of course, as we're going to talk about, data and access and other things. So if you think about kind of an iceberg metaphor, maybe as the internet, at the top, the bit above the water is where we all know and love the well-indexed internet that we use through search engines. Beneath that, we move into what you might have heard described as the deep web, where it requires a little bit of know-how to get around, where communities and forums might be closed and not as well indexed. And what we're talking about is below that, the deep web, which requires, as we said, a degree of know-how in order to get to, and Tor being one of the primary pieces of technology used there.
Okay, so just for the audience here, just for folks that are kind of non-technical, so when I go ahead and use my Chrome browser and I'm browsing the kind of what we call I guess the surface web, right? Top level. We use that to interact with our, various websites and so forth. But there's a whole kind of underground beneath that I need to have specialized tools like this Tor browser you're talking about, which basically just makes me anonymous, right? And then I can go
Yes.
ahead and kind of move around, but I'm kind of going through kind of the internet underbelly, so to speak. Is that
That's exactly right. Yeah.
okay?
We'll take a few peeks at some examples of that, as well as some examples drawn from Telegram and some of those other spaces. But yes, the Tor browser in its kind of initial purpose was to provide this layer of privacy protection, and it is a specialized piece of software that you use, you have to install, and that you then connect to the Tor network, which it's a protocol that rides on top of the existing global telecommunications, the internet as we all know it, but it's wrapped up in this Tor protocol that protects it and manages how the data moves through the network. And that's kind of like the origins of the initial dark web. Since then, it's expanded to include things like Telegram, where cyber criminals have found great success operating. And yeah, on the next slide, we'll have a peek at some examples there.
Cool. Just one last point around Tor. So Tor is not something that you would want to find on a business network, right? Generally speaking.
That's right. Generally speaking, no, it
Okay.
is not. It's purpose-built software. It has its origins in U.S. government research, the U.S. Navy, I believe it is, many years ago, and still supports it. But yeah, from a business perspective and from an IT professional's point of view, we would think of Tor as unusual, unless we've got business applications for it, or if journalists, as an example, and many other types of communication do leverage it for privacy protection. But generally speaking, it would be unusual.
Yeah. Kind of reminds me of a story interesting story I would want to share. So one of our first clients that started using some of our advanced kind of security, kind of monitoring and comprehensive visibility platform is a medical group. And it turned out that we discovered that Tor was actually running on this regulated infrastructure, which is not supposed to be. And it turned out it was a personal machine. And it was actually one of the internal team members at this organization that was running Tor. And they were actually using the internet at the office to go ahead and crypto mine, which is sort of generating Bitcoin, right? Which is not what you want to see on your internal regulated network. And just oftentimes these things are running, but we have no visibility around that.
Yeah, this is key. Yeah, this insight into what's running in the environment from a monitoring perspective. We'll talk about some of these protections. Awareness as to something, whether Tor is present in your environment, is a huge leg up in that regard. Absolutely. Um, yeah, transitioning now, a little closer look at these images on the left are just meant to reflect kind of the nature of navigating the dark web, whether it's Tor or other communities on the dark web. Really, what this requires is just a level of know-how, quite frankly. What you see here are some examples from what's called the Hidden Wiki, which is a service that does its best to track website activity on Tor. There are many other kind of similar resources like that. And on the open web, you can see at the bottom there an example drawn from Reddit, where communities pay attention to what is going on the dark web and related communities and try and percolate some of that up to the open web, just to give people, a window in and an access point to get in there. But generally, the dark web is tricky to get around on. You really need to know at least where to begin looking. And that applies not only to the markets, which we're going to talk about as some examples, but it also applies to the communities, of course, as well. On the dark web, just kind of generally speaking, we're of course interested in cybercrime and the ecosystem that surrounds it, which we're going to talk about. But as a part of that, you'll see on the last bullet, there's a whole bunch of other very conventional IT services and financial services that kind of live in this dark web space as well, many of which are leveraged, of course, by cyber criminals. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those examples: web hosting, escrow for financial transactions, email services, all of those kinds of things, just like on the surface web, exist on the dark web as well.
So there's a lot to digest there. So it sounds like there's a lot of activity happening kind of underneath the surface that most people are not going to have a lot of awareness around. So with that in mind, let's kind of expand the focus to cybercrime, and let's talk about how criminals are really leveraging this dark web to do their malfeasance. So let's talk about that.
Excellent. Good word choice as well. Yes. So what we've seen happen in certainly the last three, but it's gone on for further than that as well. Several years, we've seen sort of the emergence of a complex economy, an ecosystem of sorts around cybercrime. Of course, largely centered around the dark web. It serves as a great hub for this activity and platform for it to take place on. But really, what began as small groups sort of conducting operations has evolved into complex supply chains, very clear definition of roles and responsibilities, and the emergence of commercial entities to help support all of this. As we all know, the business of cybercrime is booming, unfortunately. And as we can see on the dark web, there's been a really clever organization of resources in order to achieve, criminal outcomes really effectively. And this economy is something that, as cybersecurity professionals, we've come to pay more and more attention to. A simple metaphor would be, in the physical security world, if we're responsible for building security, we of course want to understand how the bad guys are likely to try and gain access to our building. So we would pay attention to that. The same sorts of conversations and resources and training and all these kinds of things exist on the internet, largely centered on the dark web. And it's allowed for the emergence of what you see here, some of these bullet points that we'll dive into as we go here. But first, the emergence of these markets and related sites. We call them breach sites or paste sites. You may have heard other terms referred to them. And those were sort of the earliest part of the dark web that as cybersecurity professionals we were concerned with. That's evolved now into this cybercrime as a service and related elements of it. We'll kind of bounce down through those as we go and dig a little deeper in.
What's interesting is that I've heard that if you were to look at cybercrime as a country, it would actually be the third largest economy in the world, following the United States and China. That's according to the World Economic Forum. That's pretty amazing. Third largest country in the world of cybercrime.
It is, and unfortunately, gosh, it's not surprising. And just as a simple like anecdotal example, the Lockbit. So one, admittedly, it's a family of ransomware, but sort of one primary strain of ransomware is $100 and some million US business. And there are dozens of these strains, and that's just one type of application for cybercrime in this context. That doesn't even speak to the reuse value of stolen data. So absolutely, the business of cybercrime, the cost, and therefore the value from an attacker's perspective is extraordinarily high. And let's dive in a little further. We are going to begin with markets. So in the kind of early days, when us as cybersecurity professionals were becoming aware of the dangers that lurk in spaces like the dark web, ransomware was a big headline item, and these dark web markets really began to become prominent. And they've gone through many iterations, and there are many different types. They take many different forms, and they operate differently. A few key takeaways here. So first and foremost, they primarily serve two concerns. The first is to provide access to compromised systems or accounts. And this is where, as part of that ecosystem, we've seen a role that's usually referred to as an access broker emerge. And so that's a cyber criminal whose job it is to gain access to systems and networks, corporate, personal, it doesn't matter, and hold that access and then resell it primarily is what they do. And that access applies to accounts, email accounts, and every other account as well. So in the context of these markets, access is for sale. The other thing, and the thing that's usually on most of our minds is data. Of course, these markets are home to tons and tons and tons of data. It's difficult to get a really good handle on. for many reasons. First and foremost, there is simply a lot of it. It changes very quickly. The world of cybercrime is very active. New breaches are happening continuously. And the third kind of complicating and slightly annoying thing is that some of the data, I shouldn't say a lot, but quite a bit of it, gets sort of repackaged and rebundled and then resold. This matters to us as IT professionals because that repackaging of data often carries with it opportunity for password spraying attacks as a very simple example, where any number of attackers are going to have great dictionaries of known passwords that they can just spray out over and over again in the hopes that somebody has reused the password. Anyway, in these markets and the breach sites, there is an enormous amount of data. Couple of pieces to be mindful of here, just by way of understanding the type of data. Three key points. What is called fulls in kind of like, cool hacker speak, refers to simply a package of information about a business or a person. And you're going to see this in the news, and you probably have been seeing this in the news from time to time. Lots of big breaches. Power School, Hertz, which we're going to talk about, and many others have kind of introduced this concept into the modern awareness, wherein what the attackers are keenly aware of is that this data not only has value to extort the victim that they have just encrypted it on or stolen it from, but this data can also be reused for fraud after the fact, identity theft, et cetera. And so in the context of these markets, we see that exchange of data happen continuously. The other thing, just for kind of interest to note here, the example that I plucked was British prison floor plans were apparently leaked on the dark web last year, just to show kind of the range of information that makes its way out there. It's not all just credit card information or our addresses and phone numbers and things like that. All kinds of intellectual property is, of course, stolen and made available. The usual pattern in this context is that the data will be taken, exfiltrated, stolen. There's a bunch of different ways we like to fancy it up. And there will be an initial attempt to sort of extort that victim for payment. You can read about this in innumerable examples as of late. And if that payment is not received, the data is usually leaked. And that's where these breach sites generally kind of pop into our consciousness. And these markets are kind of the probably the first thing on our minds in the dark web.
You mentioned data leakage. Personal story. So I happen to live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and about a year and a half ago, the city of Oakland, where I happen to reside, city of Oakland got ransomware, and they had a massive breach. And city services were down for like 6 weeks. No one could, the only city services that were available were emergency and 911 services, but anything else was down for 6 weeks. They were in a negotiation with the hacker, and the hacker basically said, "Hey, I've gone ahead and I've sucked out all your employee data. And if you guys don't go ahead and pay me, I'm going to go ahead and release that and publish that online." Negotiations continued. The city decided not to do that. And the hacker, to your point, went ahead and published online the list of all the current city employees, personal information, et cetera, up into including present and previous mayor as well. And then had to provide credit monitoring services, et cetera, for all the victims whose information just got leaked. So we're seeing that as pretty frequent occurrence these days, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the lived example that you've got there, Rob, is the pattern we see almost every time with a ransomware operator: initial extortion and then the leak or exposure of the data. Absolutely. Let's jump into the next one. Right, so the access broker in that ecosystem, or sort of supply chain, or supply chain is a great way of thinking about it. For us as IT professionals, this is probably somebody that we should be the most attentive to. And why I say that is because most cybercrime begins by way of an attack of opportunity. It's rare that cyber criminals invest a tremendous amount of time and energy in order to build clever exploits to target one organization. Generally speaking, they're looking for existing vulnerabilities. So when a new CVE, a common vulnerability enumeration, is published, ransomware actors will quickly turn that around in order to exploit that vulnerability to gain access. The other thing that these groups will look for is the example you see here. This is a Telegram channel, just like the opening snap from a group called RDP Stealer. The name speaks for itself. So RDP is Remote Desktop Protocol. This Telegram group exists just to trade in known exposed RDP access. So if you're running RDP as part of your network configuration, you of course want to make sure that you have that well protected. Groups like this spend their days probing for exposed RDP and doing things like password spray attacks using breached data sets to try and gain access. So access to compromised systems and networks as part of this ecosystem in that early stage is an enormous part of what we're seeing in this space. And we can jump right in to the next. Compromised accounts following closely on the heels of compromised networks or systems. This is a big one because business email compromise is undoubtedly something you have heard of. It is probably the leading, it's tough to get a really solid handle around, but in our experience, this is probably the number one initial point of access is a social engineering account against a business email account, and that gains a foothold into the network. So the attacker gains an email account that they can then use to send email messages to others in the company, or it might have access to SharePoint, depending on the services at play and those kinds of things. In the exact same pattern, access brokers at this early stage provide and facilitate access to compromised accounts. One key takeaway here, just before we jump on to the next one, is to be mindful of the importance of understanding it isn't just about email accounts necessarily, although that's a big one. It's used for financial fraud, obviously, all kinds of risk inherent in the way we transact business via email. But cyber criminals are also looking for accounts that are used to control IT services, like your domain registration. If they can change the IP address that your domain name resolves to, they control all kinds of things. Those accounts need to be managed and protected, and you need to be mindful of them in the exact same way.
Yeah.
Important takeaway there.
Very important points there. We see a lot of compromised email accounts, and a lot of it stems from a two-factor authentication. That's when you get either a text to your phone or you have your authenticator app and you click approve. If you're not doing that as part of your email logins, that's something that you want to look into and make sure that that's enabled. Very frequent kind of vector to get into a particular account and ultimately a network and a company. We also see a lot of reused accounts, reused passwords. People are using passwords in multiple places. I know it's really difficult to keep track of all the passwords that we all have, hundreds and thousands of passwords that we all have to remember. But we're making it easier for the hacker if we're going to go ahead and reuse the same password in multiple accounts. So, ideally, folks are using some sort of password manager to go ahead and manage their passwords with ideally, every system, every account should have a unique login and a unique password. Goes also back to security training for your team and making sure that these best practices, it's like low-hanging fruit kind of fundamentals kind of stuff, but a lot of times it's not done. So making sure that that's standard practice is a huge risk reduction exercise.
Yeah, absolutely. Compromised data. This is the thing on most of our minds. We've already kind of spoken about this, but so generally speaking, we'll talk about the example at the end. We'll take a little look at a brief case study here, but the compromised data takes many, many forms. PII, personally identifiable information, is a term that you'll undoubtedly hear about or will in the future. Largely what the attackers are looking for is any data. They don't even care what it is. The more sensitive, the more leverage they have, but they will just grab everything they can and then sort it out later. Financial data and intellectual property are obviously the biggest hitters and the most risk for us. But the trade in compromised data usually follows a pattern of initial attempt to extort the victim before sale. Okay, so kind of framing this all up under the umbrella of cybercrime and or malware as a service, ransomware as a service, and phishing as services are all terms that you will hear. Really, what we're talking about is now a very robust, as we said earlier, ecosystem with, frankly, quite sophisticated actors behind them. Of course, there's the usual low-hanging fruit, unsophisticated operators, of course. But as we've seen, certainly in the last 3 years, moving into the space of info stealers, which we'll talk very briefly about next, we've seen a really sophisticated evolution in the organization of cybercrime and therefore the outcomes, of course, which the media it's easy to find examples of this. The key takeaways that I kind of would like everyone to be mindful of here is that we've moved into an age where we frankly have very well developed, very well supported platforms for doing cybercrime at scale. And that's kind of become the norm. That's an important thing for us to be mindful of as IT professionals.
Yeah. So going just kind of piggyback off this a bit, we had a prospect that came to us and they were having in the middle of a cyber incident. And what had happened was they were a small CPA firm, like I think it was like 6 people, pretty small. Uh, One of the principals there had gotten, you mentioned info stealers, had gotten their password compromised. And the threat actor was able to log in as this principal. And as a CPA firm, they make their money by transacting with the IRS and handling tax returns and so forth. The hacker basically submitted up to the IRS 185 fraudulent tax returns and tax refund requests. And you can imagine what is going to happen here. The IRS got wind that they were getting a lot of fraudulent tax returns and then went ahead and blacklisted this CPA firm. And it took that CPA firm over a year and a half just to deal with all the fallout, the reputational damage, the client loss, all of that stuff to rebuild their business to go ahead and still keep going. And it's just something like, again, it doesn't really matter what size business it is. It can be a very small CPA firm and you can still get walleted by this stuff. And it's really important, again, have these fundamentals in place to make sure that you're protected and lowering that risk.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, yeah, moving now into info stealers. So, inside this ecosystem, this term has emerged maybe in the last 3 or so years, and really it's just malware, like all malware. But what info stealers have done in the last little while is made available to the dark web huge packages of stolen credentials by way of these little bits of malware. And what an info stealer does is it just gets onto our computer, and I'll talk very briefly about the couple of ways it does, and then it just sucks up information. And they're configured in different ways to steal different types of information. But things like in the context of our web browser, stored passwords, cookies, so session information that a bad guy could use to then on a different computer insert themselves or join an existing session, an authentication to a service, things like that. And those passwords are part of what has been making the news lately. So the info stealer ecosystem has emerged and really forced us all to pay critically close attention to like what are some fundamentals like Rob just mentioned, like ensuring that your web browser is always up to date, critically important, and ensuring that your users recognize social engineering, especially in the context of email or instant messaging, like on platforms like LinkedIn. These are the ways that these info stealers are making their way onto our systems. Out-of-date browser, visiting a bad website, info stealer gets installed. User clicks a hyperlink, does not have a secondary security protection that does any sort of like file scan or anything like that, info stealer gets installed. Anyway, these info stealers have been making huge news. And frankly, what they lead to, you can see at the end here, are what we've described earlier. So account takeovers are by far the most common. So you can imagine your password is stolen by an info stealer. It's shared with a bad guy. The bad guy then logs into the account. That's exactly what happens there. A lot of these bits of malware had their early days in the cryptocurrency. They were trying to steal people's crypto wallets in the browser extension context, but they've evolved now to be looking for all of our passwords and a whole bunch of other information as well. Last piece here, maybe a little bit of a good news story. It's important to be mindful of, and it's something certainly you'll catch wind of here and there in the news. In the context of the dark web, law enforcement internationally is very active and, of course, very well aware of what is going on out there. You'll see some examples here just shared mostly for interest. It's not uncommon for law enforcement to take down dark web markets, to take down or take control of Telegram channels that are used. And here exactly in the bottom one, you can see the founder of Telegram has been recently dealing with legal troubles, just sort of based on how vigorously Telegram has been used by cyber criminals. So key takeaway, law enforcement is very active in that space as well. Okay, just a quick look. We'll do this one relatively speedily because it's a very familiar story. In this context, it's something that happened to Hertz. It happened in parallel to many other companies. And this pattern is reflective of a lot of what goes on in the dark web and certainly in the cybercrime ecosystem. So I thought I would just share this one quickly. Late last year, you may have heard of the Clop ransomware gang and the Clio file transfer software. Before Clio, there was something called Move It, which made the news big time as well. Same thing. Here's what happened. So in October last year, a vulnerability is discovered in this Clio software. They patch it, or they think they have. They release the patch. The patch is very quickly examined by a whole bunch of people, including bad guys, who figure out how to exploit whatever that patch was addressing. As it turned out, the patch was not entirely successful. And so bad guys were able to exploit that vulnerability. And they gained access to Hertz systems, Sam's Club, a barrage. I think it was like 62 companies in the end. And then the same pattern happened. They gain initial access. They immediately spread through the network. They begin exfiltration and encryption of data, and then they try to extort the victim. In parallel, they posted on, you can see the bottoms, the two images here are taken from the Clop ransomware gang's dark websites at different times, just showing how they expose the data. So they give you the opportunity to download samples of this data. While all of this was happening, there were still hundreds of vulnerable systems running Clio exposed to the internet. And anyone in the world could see and find them via services like Shodan, which is a scanning utility, publicly available. Anyone can use it. And go and exploit the vulnerability themselves if they wanted to. What I want you to take away from here is the timeline within which it happened and the urgency with which patching has to be addressed, and that really awareness of whether a patch even worked or not is required. This is a great, when I say great, I really mean an unfortunate example of that process very, very quickly. So October, by January, data was on the dark web. This is a large corporation, several large companies with sophisticated operations, and this pattern repeats over and over and over again. In this context, I don't remember exactly what the total volume of data lost was, but like Rob's example earlier, credit protection and monitoring and all of these things have come as a result of it, because the data, of course, included a great deal of financial information and PII, personally identifiable information. But it's a great example of a case that you can very easily learn more about with just a quick internet search. The Clio and the Clop ransomware story made big news in the last few months.
A lot of stuff going on there. So let's kind of start to wrap things up here and let's kind of get down to the bottom line here. So what should people be doing to protect themselves, and what can we be doing as companies? What can we be doing as a country? What can we be doing as an individual?
Yes, so the most important piece that any of us can do, and this applies to our security generally, is have awareness, great insight, great visibility. One of the interesting pieces about the dark web is it's become accessible to us as security professionals in a way that it wasn't. And when I say accessible, I mean we've gained an awareness of it, and we've now been able to build systems for monitoring, for identifying the presence of data, account exposures, and all kinds of things like that. And so that identification piece is by far the most important. And that's where we can help you out with a great deal in the reporting context and monitoring as well. These best practices are something that you've probably seen here and there before. They apply not only in the account context, but certainly in the system context, depending on things like configuration, passwords as an example. But key takeaways here. MFA, of course, over and over again, is absolutely essential. Of course, there are mechanisms that attackers use that can bypass MFA, but it is still one of the most robust protections that you can apply. And fundamentally, it will mitigate a huge number of the types of attacks that we're talking about, those password spraying attacks, things like that. Do not use corporate email accounts for non-work related services. If those other services are themselves compromised, your email address and the password that was held in that service might also be compromised. And of course, if you've reused that password, you're of course in big trouble. But more importantly, just your corporate email address is associated with the service unnecessarily. Very important. Use of complex passwords and non-reuse, absolutely essential. Rob mentioned things like a password manager, and monitoring is absolutely critical. Just an awareness of what's going on in your IT environment and to your business email accounts, as an example, is essential. Without that level of visibility, you're fighting blind. And any level of human verification is essential. And I would also add there, at the human level, awareness. So awareness training, particularly as it relates to social engineering, is an important best practice to have in place. And yes, by way of reporting, and as it relates to the monitoring, ITS has a great offering here. Rob, did you want to dive right into that?
Yeah, so we talked about, having that awareness of what's going on, having that monitoring and that real-time notification, almost kind of like almost like a real-time alarm system for your network, for your infrastructure, right? We're able to do that through our ITS secure platform. So with that, having that visibility provides companies with the ability to go ahead and respond very quickly. You notice you mentioned earlier about the time window that just seems to be closing and getting faster and faster between the point that a threat actor gets into a network to when they actually bring down the network. That timeline has just steadily decreased over time. And it's really at this point, the protections that companies have is real-time monitoring and notification. The sooner you know about it, the sooner you can do something, the sooner you can get it out and prevent it. It's not a question of if, it's really just when. And having that visibility is a big deal. With that, to that end, we're offering as part of this kind of webinar here, the ability to go ahead and just get a free assessment, an understanding of just kind of where you're at, what are the gaps currently that you have. You can go ahead and drop us an email at secure@itsasap.com. I'll put a link in the chat so everybody can see that. And that will go ahead and start the process of just getting an understanding of where you're at. You mentioned dark web during this whole time, right? We can actually go ahead and provide a scan of your network, a report that's going to tell you what credentials that you currently have exposed. And we can go ahead and provide that as part of this value add for this webinar. So we'll go ahead and put that links in the chat for everybody in a second here. All right, so we got a bunch of questions. So I want to kind of move on to that. And let's see, first question here is, bring that up here. What can we do to make sure that our data and servers are secure? We've kind of alluded to some of this already. Earl, if you want to give that a stab, and then I'll get that link out into the chat for everybody.
Yes, for sure. Just in terms of general IT security in that context, ensuring that you have robust monitoring in place is critical. Understanding your IT environment is the first step. So knowing what you need to protect, having an inventory, all those kinds of things, fundamental. And then applying technical protections, endpoint monitoring, network monitoring, et cetera, is fundamental. And the more robust that can be, the better. And if that can include active mechanisms to take action should an event happen, even better.
All right, very good. Let me go back to my other screen here. Other question that has come in: how serious is the threat of credential theft for smaller business compared to large corp companies? So we kind of talked a little bit. Does it matter about the size of a company?
Yeah, it is. It's tough to really say definitively. The impact has everything to do with the account itself. In a small organization, though, at least in my experience, the accounts tend to be of higher value because there's fewer people, doing more roles, et cetera. So from an attacker perspective, the first thing that they're going to look for is an opportunity target. Doesn't matter who it is. After that, they'll get fancy and selective. So it is important to have an understanding of like who plays what role in your company. Your IT team will be targeted by a sophisticated actor before your HR department. No slight against HR, just as an example.
Sounds good. Could my business face legal or financial consequences if employee or customer data ends up on the dark web?
Yes, unfortunately, fortunately, depending on how you look at it, yes, absolutely. These days, there are an increasing number of class action suits being brought against data holders who have lost control of that data. There, a quick internet search would find you some examples if you're particularly interested. Jurisdiction and other things are considerations, absolutely, but even just the reputational cost can't be underestimated. So yes, this is an enormous consideration for us.
All right, next question. If one of my business partners gets hacked, could my company's data also end up on the dark web? So, kind of working with some partners, I'm sharing some information. What's my risk and exposure there?
Yes, 100%. Again, there's like variability in how the scenario might unfold, but a couple of situations. If your data, if information about you and your business is held by a partner, a vendor, whatever, and they are compromised, that information about you might be stolen and lost and misused. So if this includes your financial details, bank account information, in terms of like a vendor relationship, this could be very problematic. The other scenario is if that other account, device, whatever it turns out to be, is leveraged as a launching point for attacks against you, it could give the attacker a point of trust from which to launch an attack. That's another important angle to consider there.
What is the one best practice every business owner should follow to prevent and reduce exposure on the dark web? If you're going to start with one thing, what would that be for you?
Really robust monitoring of your IT environment. This is where all the data leaks come from. They come from our IT environments, those IT environments that we control. Of course, if our data lives on systems we don't control, that is out of our reach. But yes, really robust monitoring of your IT environment is fundamental. It's essential, in my opinion. And not having that is unfortunately just sort of like leaving the doors unlocked until something bad happens.
Yeah, and I would add to that just having robust fundamentals, patching your systems. You mentioned patching your web browsers, making sure that you have the latest version of that, making sure that you have two-factor enabled for any system of any criticality, your bank account, any financial systems, purchasing accounts, social media accounts, anything that's public facing. All of those should be two-factored and protected. Making sure that your team is trained so they can start to recognize they're the first line of defense for many businesses. How can I go ahead and make sure that they have the fundamentals that they need in order to go ahead and recognize these attacks as they come in? Because they're getting them on a constant barrage. And we're all get distracted. We all got lots going on, and being able to kind of recognize these things as it comes in just becomes really critical to go ahead and just lower a company's risk. So I'll just add that. All righty. Let's see if anybody else, any other questions. I'll give another couple seconds here. And then with that, we'll let everybody get back to their day. All right. So Earl, I just want to say thank you. Appreciate your time. Really educational and informational discussion here, and I hope that's been valuable for the folks out there. Please go ahead and reach out to us, Secure at ITS ASAP. You got the link in the chat there if you'd like to go ahead and get your free assessment. Thank you very much, and we'll catch everybody on the next go round. Take care.